Good morning, Anthony Franco. How are you?
How are you, Chris? I'm suffering from a little bit of a food coma from yesterday. How are you doing?
How much pie did you eat yesterday?
I ate no pie, but I had my weight in cookies and mashed potatoes.
I mean, your low carb diet seems to be really working out.
It was Christmas. Come on.
It's cheat day. It is the cheat day. Anthony, when Bell Labs first experimented with transistors, their radical breakthroughs came partly from an unorthodox office setup that made cross-disciplinary chatter inevitable. That's Conway's law in action. I think we're going to find out that's Conway's law in action. How teams communicate determines what they produce. Today, we have Mr. Noah Healy. He's a recreational mathematician. I don't even know what a recreational mathematician is. I'm sure I'm gonna ask that as well. And programmer on a mission to upgrade capitalism for the computer age. He merges markets, math, and technology to fuel stronger economies, bridging the gap for the history, culture, and economics. That is a big introduction. No, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. I feel like, we're going to bring your IQ level down a few points. The average IQ level has dropped since we came on.
It was my understanding that there would be no math.
That's exactly right. So let's just dive into it. Tell me what Conway's law is and why should I care about that as a founder?
Absolutely. Well, Conway's law, I believe, was first written about explicitly in the 60s, and it says that the communication pattern of a design team is identical to the actual layout of the designs that the team produces. And Conway wasn't writing about computers explicitly, and the example he uses is cars. If the team that's designing the wheel of your car and the team that's designing the axle do not talk to each other, then the wheel and the axle of your car will not connect to one another.
So that classic case of not, well, you put this as a round hole and you put this as a square hole, right? Like that's the fundamental idea.
Absolutely, yes. But to sort of get into why this is the case, without that back and forth flow of communication, there will not be a way for those parts to become compatible. And so as each team changes their side of things for what they need and what problems they encounter, they will diverge from each other in ways that create incompatibilities unless they're in constant communication about co-evolving those interfaces.
Yeah, and it's strikes me as one of the fundamental rules we talk about, Anthony, which is how startups tend to break at these different points. Like when you get to 10 people, they kind of start to break a little bit. And then when you get to 20 people is the first time when you really start to see challenges with culture and communication. And then 50 and then 100, those are times when it's really difficult to maintain those levels of communication. Has that been your experience, Anthony?
100%. So early stage, right? The whole team gets to go out and interview somebody before they add him to the team. 5 of you go to lunch. The 6th person is being part of the interview, and you get to see if there's you get to see if there's a fit. Once you hit 10, that becomes an expensive recruiting effort. But yeah, so there's definitely different levels, and you can argue that really effective teams are small teams because of that.
Well, yeah, one of the consequences of this is that small teams and small systems that they can actually build and maintain can have this incredibly cohesive internal structure. However, if your system becomes larger, then a critical part of managing that system is actually managing those interfaces in ways that will match up to team communication. And so for founders, the thing that I see missed most often, having worked at several different startups, is the understanding that bringing on new team members is not simply a matter of finding people who are, intelligent or skilled or cultural fits or any of those things. You are also fundamentally redesigning your core product if you do that kind of work, particularly in computers where it's just so easy to redesign your core product. And most founders are unaware of the fact that they are engaging in computer programming when they're hiring and firing and promoting and so on. And because they don't even know they're doing it, they do it very, very badly. And
Yeah, no,
that,
I mean, we do most things badly, Noah. It's not just this. There's lots of things that we as founders do poorly. But yeah, you're right about that. Yeah.
right. And so that's one of the issues is I've seen companies that wound up getting stalled out from some basically unrepayable technical debt because the founder wanted to do a bunch of things and he found people who told him that they would start working on those things in exchange for hiring teams to start working on them. He launched multiple simultaneous teams to move the product in multiple different directions, and they diverged the product in ways that were incompatible. And then he wanted all those things at the same time, and he never got them ever.
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean,
they,
it's a classic. It's a classic. Like, this is the funding paradox, which is if somebody comes in and dumps a bunch of money on you, and you're like, "Hey, great, I just promised these 20 things that we're going to build all at the same time," and you realize that you build, none of them actually work together. You develop tremendous amount of tech debt. You put all kinds of pressure on your, some architecture, and everything breaks, and you never get the second round. Like, I mean, we see that all the time.
exactly. And so the critical thing is that with awareness of Conway's law, you can take a conscious position to include the technical people who indeed might be hard to talk to, along with the strategic guidance, because there actually isn't a difference between those two activities, and get people onto that same page. Uh, while your organization will have to have levels in order to deal with, particularly if you're getting into that, 50 to 150 or larger size range, um, you have to still be able to operate flatly uh, for overall system design, unless you've actually adopted an architecture that can cope with that relational level and separation. And that's where some of the abandoned approaches that people have gotten away from for efficiency's sake. Uh, that's where you have to sort of go back to the old, less efficient ways that were developed actually specifically so that you could have people doing different things and still coming together and working. So operating
So
system based programming.
let me see if I understand this, and then let's see if we can, pull this into the practical conversation about how do we start to think about solving this problem, which is what you're suggesting is Conway law says is that I need to be very conscious as a founder to make sure I understanding that I'm building not just a team of people and throwing people together to go solve a problem, but I need to understand that I'm building a system, and I'm trying to build a system of systems whereby if you're building a feature, you have to have some form of communication with the other teams. There has to be collaboration in that environment. Is that a fair summation to this point?
Yes, but not just that collaboration, but also the effects of collaboration. So if you have say a database module that needs to be isolated from another part of development just so that things don't get too complicated, and your database architect makes friends with like the QA group, uh, you know, those two systems will in fact, because they're talking to each other, grow into one another. And that actually can cause problems on its own.
Right.
So,
Like if you're trying to keep something separate, it's the opposite is true as well, which
right,
is like if you're trying to keep things isolated, like the famous Skunkworks projects, where you're like, oh, Steve Jobs took over a building to build the Mac and put up a pirate ship flag on top of it. It was trying to physically isolate those. But if you have too much collaboration in that environment, you will just kind of get a graying of that. That's kind of the other
exactly.
side of the question?
Yeah. So yes, you have to analyze your organizational problems from the organizational standpoint of making payroll and something, and also the personnel payroll viewpoint from leadership and relationships, but in fact also from the technical viewpoint. And the personnel and the technical turn out to be identical problems. And so if there's a friendship or a inimical relationship that's in the wrong place from a technical perspective, then that will cause you serious heartache down the line.
Got it. Okay, so we understand now what Conway's law is. We understand that we need to be conscious of what's going on, and even though that this makes perfect logical sense, it's something we tend to ignore, which is the people that we have and around the relationships that those people have tend to help, or will tend to um, largely determine the quality of the outcomes that we're looking for. And so as we're thinking about this problem, how should I, as a founder, start to think about structuring my company as I'm starting to grow? And I think a good way to think about it is like how Anthony and I approached it in these breakpoints. As we start to get bigger, how can I A, take advantage of it, and B, avoid the pitfalls?
The best approaches I'm aware of are structuring your systems around the communication channels that exist. And you do that again at both the personnel and the technological levels. So getting away from the traditional ideas of having business structure of VPs and C-suite and things like that, and towards a system around having communication-based services that are doing some process, whether it's a machine or a person or a combination. Um, this has its drawbacks as well, but companies like Amazon are very famously successful in that. There's an excellent book called Flow-Based Programming. I've corresponded with the author before, where he talks about how to design systems pretty much from the ground up in this fashion. I wrote a programming language once that was based on that principle before I had met him or read his book. And in sort of more advanced terms, I've been working on game theory approaches to allow you to actually quantize these kinds of relationship ideas and set up mutually self-reinforcing incentives around reaching some common interested goal. And so those sorts of approaches are how to exploit Conway's law for your benefit.
So, Anthony, I totally get this. I think this makes sense. Talk to me about, as you were growing, maybe it was an Effective or another company, what were some of the things that you did right and did wrong to start to build a culture that took advantage of this idea that both communication relationships are the most important thing?
This is really funny. I think every founder decides to not do things the way they've always been done. They're gonna organize their company in a radically new, different way because they've seen how inefficient hierarchical management structures are.
Right, and we all quit
Right.
to start our company because we hated
Right.
the hierarchical
Right.
structure.
So we're gonna
Right.
do something different. I'm gonna do this different, right?
I'm gonna
Everybody's voice is
reinvent
gonna be heard,
management systems.
right? The irony of it is, people are used to those hierarchical structures. So if you try to design something different, they're confused as what to do and who's leading and where. Like it in on paper, it makes a lot of sense. But in practice, it's actually very difficult to do it in practice to have this open communication structure and essentially non-hierarchical reporting structures.
Yeah, and Noah react to that. I mean, because I get it, but it does become hard in the moment. The key here is that in an early stage company, I don't have the time to sit down and communicate with every single employee in the way that would really build these tight bonds.
Well, that's where we get into some of the algorithm sides of things, where we see why larger companies are in fact becoming so inefficient, because computer science has offered us several approaches that we happen to know for a mathematical fact are superior to the hierarchical structure that human beings much more naturally fall into. And again, that's where we get into the challenge of the identity between the social and the technical. In
Yes,
in
that's the
order
rub.
to yes, in order to keep your eye on the prize and actually maintain these technical solutions, um, you actually have to stay conscious of that as a founder and prioritize that. And to some extent, like, kind of old style Boeing and some other companies have done this, you have to have faith in market recognition of sort of correctness. You have to do the right thing for the right reason, and just take it on faith that your reward will come your way. Uh, and that is a very hard thing to do. People get distracted by their day to day. But again, the advantages that can accrue to you from using these machines efficiently are enormous. I've seen numerous cases where systems have become hundreds of thousands, hundreds of millions, even times more efficient than their pre-existing approaches. And if those sorts of advantages start accumulating, it becomes quite considerable very rapidly. And so that's what it takes. And it isn't, again, necessary for the founder to sort of hold the entire technical specs in their head. In fact, as you were to scale up, that becomes unnecessary or impossible. But you do need to maintain that kind of discipline. So again, as an example of a company that has been successful with these sorts of approaches, uh, Amazon. I've actually run into a handful of ex Amazoners, and they're a very strict, tight groups that are largely isolated from each other, except through the tech interfaces that are service communications. Most of those groups essentially attempt to keep their services as private as possible, because they don't want to suddenly become a linchpin of the company and have the headaches and heartaches that are associated with everyone in the company, sort of depending on their software. But if that does happen to you, and you suddenly are holding up some critical part of Amazon because they decided to build on top of your infrastructure, uh, at your morning stand up, Jeff Bezos shows up and starts asking, why you personally are ruining his company. Uh,
Which that would be a bad day, I think.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Although
I think Noah points out something really interesting here. So Amazon still like tries very hard to maintain this nimble infrastructure and how it manages products and teams. Certainly was that way when Jeff Bezos was the CEO, and it's still that it's hard to remove that culture. The benefit is is features get released very quickly, and you can be more nimble to customer demands. The problem is cohesion. If you ever look at so the consumer experience for Amazon is unparalleled. It's fantastic. That's where they spend most of their time. But everything else, if you're a seller on Amazon, it's a nightmare. It looks like a, it's a Frankenstein of features that are designed by different teams. Like a friend of mine who's an analyst for what was then Forrester Research, Ron Rogowski, he said, if you want to know how unorganized a company is, just look at their website. And I think that really defines a really good way of, if you visit somebody's website, you don't know what they do, where they are, where to go, on how that's how their company's organized, is because their website is just a complete mess. Internally, they're also a complete mess. So there are some positives to this idea of smaller teams. I do want to dive in a little bit about how do you get these smaller teams, how do you organize these smaller teams under an organizing principle, an organizing architecture, to make sure that there's a cohesive user experience for software, a cohesive operating system that this company's operating on?
It's a great question. Let me just recap really quickly. So I think that where we've gotten to this point, so we know what Conway's law is. We understand that the people in the design of the teams, the design of the organization really has massive effects on the outcome. We know that particularly now that how we think about teams and team structure really has now a massive effect on how those teams perform, for both good and bad if there's too much crossover. And I think it's an interesting point that in the modern work environment, we're seeing the lack of of structure. Like teams form and dissolve within months, weeks, et cetera. So it's changing a lot. And so we know that that's kind of part of the problem. And so back to that exact point, Noah, I know now as a founder, as I'm starting to scale up, this is a problem. I got to keep my eye on it. But I've got these two challenges. I've got to create a big vision. I know I have to go after this vision. But at the same time, these small teams need to maintain as much autonomy as possible to be able to build quality products. Is that accurate?
I would say that that is accurate. And what I would say, and sort of my approach, which I can't recommend to everybody because it's exactly the opposite of what people actually did that worked, is you completely mathematicize the big vision. So in my startup, I have a core system which you can completely implement in around 300 lines of code that actually addresses how all the interacting pieces communicate with one another from a game theory perspective. So it's all self-incentivized, and the self-incentives all mutually reinforce. And so that becomes my basic advocacy, is finding these sorts of arches in game theory space where you can create mutually self-reinforcing common interests that amount to your vision. And if you're trying to build something, which I would say Amazon is, that's larger or bigger than you can fit that around, then you should probably regard that as a stupid or evil idea, and not even try.
So I think this is where this is one of those great paradoxes, and I think it's a really interesting point, and I think it's one of those things that you as if there's no two companies that are going to be the same, which is we know, and there's tons of research pointed specifically now to Project Aristotle's, the big teams-based research that was done with Google, that we know what strong teams look like, and we know what high-performing teams look like. We know the elements of high-performing teams: primary psychological safety, autonomy, feeling like their work matters, and a number of others. And so we know the importance of these building blocks of organizations and how these teams need to have their own culture, their own power, et cetera. However, we also know that those do create building blocks for an organization. And I think probably, Anthony, the message that I would say to as founders here is just be very, very, very cautious of middle managers. I know that's I'm summarizing it too much, Noah, but you're starting to say, like, look, if you're trying to build a system, middle managers remove that network. They move the network out from that ability to communicate. Is that an experience you've had, Anthony?
Yeah, middle managers is where things go sideways for sure. The rule of thumb I always used was, and it played out to be pretty true. Every team member you add to a team that's responsible for something, you lose 10% efficiency. So at 10 people, you're kind of going backwards, right? So you get 11, 12, 13, you kind of going backward. That rule of thumb really, really kind of played out. And I do want to also mention something that Noah talked about, and that is I made the mistake of over-architecting the org structure. And so you want to plan this out, right? You want to think about this overarching principle and how you're going to architect things out and how you're going to architect teams and who's responsible for what and treat people like a computer program. And I was reminded actually by a quote from The Matrix Reloaded. Remember the architect?
Yeah.
He talked about version 1 of the architect of the Matrix, and he said it was a triumph only equaled by its monumental failure. Which I love that quote, because when you over engineer something, that's generally what happens, because it's so brilliant in its architecture that nobody understands it, nobody follows it.
So Noah, and really is the heart of this, as we started to talk about that in the title of the podcast, is communication. And so how do we as founders, we've talked a lot about structure and how we can think about those as founders. How do we create teams, how high-performing teams? How should we organize those teams? But how does this live in the world of communication? And how should I, as a founder, think about how I'm building communication structures to everybody in my organization?
Well, for communication structures, this is actually where computers really come back out from behind the curtain and start to shine, because computers are perfectly happy to do unbelievably tedious make work basically infinitely often. And so ideas like continuous integration or multi-stage continuous integration, where each action undertaken by anybody in the environment will be built and tested in a hermetically sealed environment before being brought out to wider and wider stages and eventually becoming the fabric that everybody's building upon, are things that you can invest in at any stage of the organization, and the sooner you do, the cheaper it is. And you just need to understand that it's going to scale up super linearly. PeopleSoft, for example, and this number is like 15 years old because that's the last time I talked to people from that organization. But they had a multi-stage continuous integration system, and they had 3 computers per developer, because they had the computer the developer was using, and then 2 computers that were simply engaging in the process of compiling, but also cross-compiling. So testing out whatever your changes were with the expanding network of the entire company in order to determine where the problems existed. And so to the extent that note-taking, logging, testing, building, all of these sort of blocking, tackling tasks of keeping your organization on task and on target. You know, logging, ship's logs have been a mechanism for maintaining culture in high stress situations for millennia. Uh, Having the computer there to do those things for you in ways that then cross interact back to how we actually behave becomes something that you can consciously decide to do and realize that maybe that 11th person is harder to hire than that sixth person was because you can't have the team lunch anymore. And that means that instead of having, you know, one server that's doing all the make work for the team, you don't need 10% more capacity. You might need 20% more capacity now. And then from that on until you're going to get this quadratic relationship. But
A couple of things.
computers,
A couple things hit me on this, Chris. What one is, I'm gonna kind of dive a little bit deeper on something. One, what you talked about PeopleSoft, Noah, was really interesting. So I think the analogy that I've been struggling to find, but I finally came up with it. Have you guys heard of Chesterton's fence?
absolutely, yes.
So Chris Chesterton's fence is a principle. Basically says is if you come across a fence in the middle of a road that makes no sense.
To you.
To you, it makes no sense to you. You're like, what is this fence? It's not doing anything. Why is it here? My instinct is to take the fence down. Like it's not doing anything. It's making it difficult. Well, but it was put there for a reason, right?
Because damn it, Chesterton was trying to keep his
Chesterton
cows.
put it there for a reason.
Right.
So you should be asking yourself, why is this fence here before you take it down, and try to really explore why the fence is here. As your teams get bigger, you spend your time navigating around fences, right? Like your first default should be not to knock down the fence. And you'll find this in code. You'll see this in comments. You're like, I just saw an example of this yesterday on social media where there's a comment before a function of code, and it says, we have no idea what this function does, but every time we delete it, it breaks the system. So we're leaving it here. So do not delete it, right?
Yeah,
and so
terrific.
Your systems become much, much more complex, and you're navigating around things because you don't know how they work. You have no intuition, nothing makes sense anymore. And essentially Conway's law is basically saying, if you keep your team small and focused on what you're doing, and limited focused on limited outcomes, you have a lot you're less likely to come across a fence that you don't know what it does. But I do want to talk a little bit about something intuitively. If you're talking about this infrastructure, this communication infrastructure, where natural connections are made based on how your team is structured, that generally means, well, I'm going to say something controversial. Therefore, you should not have remote teams. Remote teams are less efficient than in-person teams. I'll let you tackle that one, Noah.
I'm unaware of the current state of the studies on the remote benefits of remote versus in person. The historical studies I'm aware of are pretty actually even between those two. My favorite,
intuitively, right? Intuitively, in-person teams should operate and behave better than a remote team.
I would say that they would be able to freely internally communicate more easily, and that has certainly been my experience. Getting back to the other question, I think it's more a question of whether or not you've structured yourself around those necessities. And so if you're going to be remote, or in fact, I would say if you're even going to be a professional software developer, your systems should be explaining what they're doing. So if I were to run across a hunk of code that I could not understand what it was doing, and when it was deleted, it broke the system, what I would do is start
Find out why.
adding logging messages to that code to indicate when it was triggering, how it was triggering, and what environment it was finding itself in, until it was developing beautiful, well formatted logging messages that explained exactly what it was doing and why. And that's something that people have commented on mine before. I am not the world's best code commenter, but I write code. I write it in a compiler style. So the code that I write frequently writes other code, and the code that my code writes is extremely well commented and very well formatted and easy to read, because I'm not writing that code. The computer can do the make work of making everything pretty and exact, because it can do that work. And so that, to me, is one of the biggest shifts that people can make that's relatively easy. Make the computers do more work. Make the computers make it easier to communicate with them and with each other. And if it would be useful to have uh, extensive transcripts of every word everybody says, don't make your people write down in longhand. Have the computers do that for them. Where you can find opportunities to use computer technology to acquire that communication structure, that's where you can reap the benefits of, I would say, both of those opportunities simultaneously. You can be sort of remote and communicate as if you're in person, uh, with enough support helping you out. But if you don't have it, if you're just like, people are people, and I don't care whether you're on the other side of the world or not, yeah, I think uh, what is out of sight will become out of mind.
My favorite idea for code commenting is that everything has to be a haiku, which I think is brilliant. All right, so let's go to speed round here in a second, Noah. I'm just going to recap. I think that where we come from and what we've learned, and I'll just add a couple from the last part of this conversation, is the role of integration. And I'm thinking, Anthony, more like the role of integrator in that EOS system.
Mhm.
That has to be a very thoughtful position. And the knowledge there is that integration in this environment where you're trying to keep teams isolated and very high performing teams, integrating that work. And to your point, Noah, you can have computers do that. The second piece of that is for a layperson that's not just writing code, that it could be a sales and a marketing team. There is a similar function of using Otter AI and transcribing meetings, team meetings, et cetera, and logging those and creating some sort of a communication flow with those as well. All right, Noah, are you ready for the speed round?
Do my best. Let's
It's
see.
lightning.
I need to come up with some good music for the speed round, Chris.
I do. Yeah, it needs to be like da, 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 da.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to ask you a question, either or. Give me a brief reaction to each one. So in this case, you are a startup founder and you just rented 50,000 square feet of office space. Do you keep it as an open floor plan, or do you shove people into little corners where they can be physically isolated?
I'd give privacy over open.
Centralized versus decentralized decision making. You give teams all the autonomy, or do they have to come back to me to answer questions?
Decentralized.
How often do we sync as various teams? So if we got a team together, do we do it daily? Do we do it weekly? Do we do it monthly? How often are we getting together to communicate as a full group?
Um, I don't know that you ever need to get together as a full group. Your system should be syncing for you at the sub-second level.
Oh, I like it. Documentation. When we do communicate, should we do that verbally? Should we do that in person, or is it always should be written?
I'm dyslexic. I personally communicate verbally. I believe systems should create extensive written documentation, not only at their creation, but also as they're used. So the systems need to be continuously writing their own documentation.
I like it. And last one, when I'm building a team, should I build just a big, broad team or a highly specialized team that's focused on one singular narrow outcome, or a bigger team that has a bigger, broader goal and objective?
I'm gonna have one of my favorite Steve Yegi quotes. Big systems suck. This rule is entirely transitive. If you have built a big system, then you suck.
I like that. Is that like,
He out of his ass.
yeah.
Steve Yegi, he was a reasonably early, I think, engineer at Amazon, and then he went to Google. He has a blog that doesn't seem to be that active these days, called Steve's Drunken Blog Rants. They are highly amusing and highly informative.
All right. I think that will be our deep dive recommendation. Anthony, what did you take away? What is We As Founders? What are our bumper stickers?
This one's difficult because there's so many nuances and it depends, right? So small teams, I think where we mapped out is,
I think I'm just going to start with big systems suck. I think that's like, yeah,
big
that's
systems
it.
suck. I think that's the final takeaway. But you know, if you're designing Amazon, you're designing a big system. So you can't, Amazon doesn't exist unless there's fulfillment and infrastructure and servers and cloud storage and seller experiences and buyer experience. Like that system and advertising, that entire system is massive. So I think it comes down to, you have to break it. You have to treat it in bite-sized chunks and silo teams off to figure out those bite-sized chunks, but making them connect with one another on the regular. So you know, there's this. I always heard that silos prevent innovation, but in some certain circumstances, silos enable innovation. So there's this huge, like, it depends how you structure your team and how you've enabled team communication to you know, based on what kind of business you're building and what are the desired outcomes. So designing it up front is really critical, but not over engineering it. The smaller the team is, the more the clarity is. But here's the thing: what we're talking about, this Conway's law, is a reality. You have to embrace it, and you have to kind of plan your communication to mirror the product you envision.
I think that's my takeaway, Anthony.
Yeah.
Is that as a founder, I need to be intentional, and I need to be intentional about the teams that I build. And I need to be intentional about how those teams do collaborate or don't collaborate, and I need to be intentional about the how those are integrated, how their work is integrated together. And while there's no simple answer, we could talk about how, you know, to your point, Noah, you can have stuff compiling constantly within a tech team, but that's not necessarily true for a marketing team. But those marketing teams, international and domestic marketing, famously can never agree if the sky is blue. And so being intentional about those moments. All right. Really interesting conversation. A couple of deep dives. This week in startups, Jason Calcanis had a really interesting episode called Scaling Tech Teams. And there's one other that I have not read, but it looks pretty interesting, called Reengineering the Corporation by Michael Hammer and James Champy.
What was that thing that you mentioned also, Noah? The drunken Steve?
Steve Yegi, Yege, Drunken Blog Rants.
Drunken Blog Rants. I'm going to go check that out this afternoon. Noah, it has been great to have you. Where can we find out more information about you? Where can we connect?
Well, the easiest way to connect to me is send me an email, noahphealy@yahoo.com. I'm also on LinkedIn. I'm Noah Healy on there. You can find out about my system for how to upgrade the world's economy on my website, CoreDisc, COORDISC. There's also some like YouTube videos explaining what I'm doing, and there's a patent and a case in federal court that you can look into around that patent.
I recommend it because the entire time before the show, we did no show prep. We just talked about that, which was fascinating. It's super interesting. Anyway, Noah, thank you so much for joining us today. Anthony, what do we have coming up?
Next, we have defining your marketing messaging architecture with a guest, Angelo Ponzi. No relation.
I was going to say, we're going from the geekiest conversation I think we've had to maybe like the most
softest. The softest
marketing messages.
I'm looking forward to that. And for those of you listening, you can please follow us. Just go to howtofounder.com. You can follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, LinkedIn, wherever. Thank you so much for tuning in. Noah, thank you very much.
Thank you,
folks.
Noah.
We'll see you next time. Take care, guys.